People love to say betrayal is obvious in hindsight. It isn't. That's what makes it useful. When someone plans to stab you in the back, they do not begin with a knife. They begin with gratitude. With praise. With small acts of dependence that make you feel essential. They ask for your guidance. They quote your ideas back to you. They build an altar out of your judgment, and then they wait for you to kneel on it. I founded Voss Vector in a windowless subleased office above a bankrupt insurance firm in Lower Manhattan. We had 6 engineers, second-hand desks, and 1 whiteboard so old the marker stains never fully disappeared. I slept there 3 nights a week. Sometimes 4. We were building predictive logistics software that could see supply chain fractures before they happened, port congestion, labor stoppages, weather choke points, vendor defaults. Everyone else in the industry was selling dashboards. I was building foresight. 3 years later, Fortune called us the company that could make delay obsolete. That was when Adrian Halbrecht entered my life. He didn't come in like a raider. He came in like a rescuer. Halbrecht Capital led our Series C with polished confidence and old money restraint. Adrian was calm, elegant, surgical with language. He never raised his voice. Never repeated himself. He spoke the way certain men do when they've spent a lifetime watching judges, bankers, and senators lean in when they talk. "You're brilliant, Elias," he told me over dinner at a private club I couldn't afford to enter without him. But brilliance without institutional protection gets eaten alive. At the time, I thought that was wisdom. Now I know it was a promise. He brought discipline, prestige, and connections I genuinely needed. I brought the product, the architecture, and the future. It looked balanced from the outside. Maybe even from the inside, if you didn't stare too hard. Then came Celeste. Adrian introduced her as outside strategy counsel. That title meant nothing. Celeste never entered a room without controlling it by the second minute. She wore neutrality like a weapon. Perfect posture. Perfect diction. Perfect patience. She asked questions that sounded supportive right until you realized she was mapping where you were weak. "Who has direct authority over model deployment?" she asked me at our first executive retreat. "I do." She smiled. "That's efficient. Also fragile." Everybody nodded like she had said something profound. I remember that moment because it was the first time I felt the room shift around me without moving. Owen joined 6 months later. That part hurt in a different way. My younger brother had none of my technical ability and all of my charm. He could walk into a room full of skeptical executives and leave with golf invitations, personal cell numbers, and 3 people calling him family. I brought him in because I trusted him, because our father died believing I should look after him, and because I thought loyalty inside the company would protect me from loyalty outside it. Instead, I handed them my blind spot. The 4 of us became inseparable in public. Press photos. Conferences. Investor dinners. Adrian the statesman. Celeste the strategist. Owen the operator. Me, the founder genius. That was the mythology. Clean. Balanced. Powerful. False. Because while I was still writing core system logic myself, the company around me was being translated into a language I did not yet recognize: committee language, governance language, dilution language. Every meeting ended with 1 more item needing legal review, 1 more authority matrix, 1 more restructuring memo for future flexibility. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say there, that's the betrayal beginning. It came as paperwork. The oldest form of violence in corporate America. I started noticing other things too. Conversations ending when I entered. Board packets summarized differently in the room than in my inbox. Side glances between Celeste and Owen during questions about licensing. Adrian becoming gentler with me whenever he was about to take something. That gentleness should have terrified me. Instead, I mistook it for respect. Then one night, just after midnight, I went back to the office to retrieve a notebook I'd left in the war room. The lights were off on our floor except for the glass conference suite overlooking the river. From the hallway, I could see 3 silhouettes inside. Adrian. Celeste. Owen. No one had invited me. I should have walked in immediately. I should have opened the door and forced their faces into the light. But something in the way Owen was leaning forward, urgent, almost pleading, made me stop. Made me listen. I couldn't hear everything through the glass. Only fragments. Too early. He'll never sign, doesn't matter if the trigger is already buried. Then Celeste turned slightly, and I heard my own name. Not spoken with affection. Not with frustration. With calculation. "Elias is the asset," she said. "Which is why Elias is the problem." Silence followed. Heavy enough to change the air in my lungs. Adrian answered a moment later. Calm as ever. "Then we solve the problem before the merger cycle begins." My hand tightened around the notebook until the spiral wire cut my palm. I remember staring through that glass and realizing something cold, clean, and almost mathematical. Whatever they were planning had been discussed before tonight. This was not an argument. This was progress. And beneath the fear, another thought surfaced. A worse one. If they were already speaking like that, then the safeguards I had buried years earlier, the ones nobody knew about, the ones I built back when control still sat with me, might soon become the only reason I survived what came next. I stepped back before they saw me. By morning, Owen hugged me in the hallway and asked if I wanted coffee. That was the day I understood the real timeline. They had not just started conspiring against me. I was already late. The first thing they took from me wasn't power. It was time. Because time is the only thing you can't audit after it's gone. The board meeting invite came in at 6:12 a.m. marked urgent, governance realignment. No prior agenda. No pre-read attachments. Just a time, a room, and Adrian's name at the bottom like a signature you didn't question. That alone should have stopped me. Nothing in corporate governance happens urgently unless someone has already decided the outcome. But I still walked in. Because I still believed I was part of the decision. The room was already full when I arrived. Legal counsel. External advisors. 2 board members dialing in from London. Celeste standing near the screen with a tablet in her hand like she'd been rehearsing this moment for days. Owen seated beside Adrian, not looking at me. That was the second warning. My brother always looked at me. Elias, Adrian said calmly, gesturing toward the chair at the head of the table, my chair. We didn't want to delay. Market conditions are shifting faster than expected. I sat, slowly. What's this about? Celeste tapped her tablet, and the screen lit up with a title slide. Executive Structure Optimization Proposal. Harmless words. Surgical intent. You've built something extraordinary, she began, voice smooth, precise. But scale introduces fragility. Concentrated authority, especially over core systems, creates institutional risk. Investors have raised concerns. Which investors? I asked. She didn't answer directly. That's not the point. Of course it wasn't. Because the point wasn't discussion. It was containment. The presentation moved quickly. Too quickly. Slides filled with language designed to exhaust resistance, fiduciary exposure, continuity safeguards, transitional oversight, shared authorization layers. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every conclusion was already decided. Then came the pivot. We are proposing a temporary redistribution of executive authority, Celeste said, eyes locking onto mine. Specifically over deployment, licensing, and governance triggers. I leaned forward. Temporary? Adrian nodded. Standard practice at this stage of growth. No, I said quietly. Not this version of it. A flicker crossed Celeste's expression. Annoyance. Not because I disagreed. Because I understood. That was when Owen finally spoke. It's just to protect what you built, he said, voice softer than usual. You've been under a lot of pressure. This gives you room to focus. I turned to him slowly. Focus on what? He hesitated. And in that hesitation, something snapped into place. Because Owen was never unprepared, unless he was lying. The room shifted. Subtle, but real. One of the external advisors cleared his throat. Legal counsel avoided eye contact. Adrian folded his hands like a judge waiting for a confession. You're moving control, I said. Not sharing it. Moving it. Celeste didn't deny it this time. We're stabilizing the company. At that exact moment, a document appeared on the screen. Consent resolution, executive realignment. My name was already on it. Signed. Dated. Approved. For a second, I thought I was looking at a draft. Then I saw the timestamp. 2 days ago. My pulse slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. Because panic would have been useless here. This isn't my signature, I said. Silence. Then Adrian leaned forward slightly. Elias. You authorized this during the preliminary review. No, I said. I didn't. Celeste tapped the screen again. A video appeared. Me. Sitting in this exact room. 2 weeks earlier. Review session. I remembered it instantly. Except I didn't remember what I was watching now. Because in the video, I was agreeing. Calm. Measured. Cooperative. Looks correct, video me said. Let's proceed. The room stayed quiet long enough for doubt to start forming, exactly as they intended. Deepfake? No. Too clean. Too contextual. Too real. Which meant only one thing. They hadn't forged my signature. They had engineered my consent. A modified version of the document. A buried clause. A swapped appendix. Something small enough to pass unnoticed in a stack of 50 pages reviewed under time pressure. I looked back at the resolution. And then I saw it. Clause 7.3c. Buried halfway down. In the event of governance risk designation, executive authority may be reassigned without further consent. Governance risk designation. Undefined. Unbounded. Weaponized. You set this up, I said quietly. Celeste didn't blink. You agreed to it. That was the moment the room officially stopped being mine. Adrian raised a hand slightly. All in favor, one by one, hands went up. London. External. Advisory. Owen. Last. Slow. But deliberate. I watched my brother vote to remove me from the company I built. Not emotionally. Not reluctantly. Precisely. Motion passes, Adrian said. Just like that. No explosion. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just a line spoken in a controlled tone that erased 10 years of my life. Then came the part I didn't expect. Security will update access credentials immediately, Celeste added. That landed differently. Because governance changes take time. Transitions. Phases. Not this. This was immediate. Which meant the decision hadn't been made today. Today was just the unveiling. I stood up slowly. No transition? I asked. Adrian met my eyes. You'll remain involved. Strategically. Strategically. The corporate word for irrelevant. I nodded once. Then I walked out. No one stopped me. No one followed. Because as far as they were concerned, I was already gone. By 11:40 a.m., my keycard stopped working. By noon, my system credentials were revoked. By 1:15 p.m., my company email auto-forwarded to legal. By 3 p.m., a press inquiry hit my personal inbox asking for comment on internal instability at Voss Vector leadership. That was fast. Too fast. Which meant the narrative had already been written. All it needed now was me. I sat in my apartment, staring at my reflection in a black screen, when my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered. Elias Voss? A calm voice asked. Yes. This is regulatory compliance outreach. We've received documentation suggesting unauthorized control concentration under your leadership. I closed my eyes. There it was. The second blade. Not just removal. Exposure. Or rather, fabrication of exposure. What documentation? I asked. A pause. Then the answer that confirmed everything. We believe you're aware of the material. I almost laughed. Because now the shape of it was clear. They weren't just taking my company. They were building a version of me that deserved to lose it. Which meant something far more dangerous than betrayal was already in motion. A story. And once the world believed it, the truth wouldn't matter. I hung up slowly. Then I opened my laptop. Not my company system. Not my official accounts. Something older. Something buried. A private environment I hadn't touched in years. For a long moment, I just stared at the login screen. Because accessing it meant one thing. I was no longer trying to stop them. I was preparing to survive them. And if necessary, destroy them. But as the cursor blinked, one question cut deeper than everything else. Not how they did it, not why they did it. But something far worse. How much of this had already been activated? Without me knowing, the article went live at 6:02 a.m. Not leaked. Not rumored. Published. Front page of every financial outlet that mattered. Visionary or liability? Inside the unraveling of Elias Voss. By 6:07, my phone was vibrating nonstop. By 6:10, it stopped completely. Because no one calls you when they think you're guilty. They distance. They observe. They wait to see how far you fall. I sat at my kitchen counter, coffee untouched, watching my own name get rewritten in real time. Paragraph by paragraph. Quote by quote. Anonymous sources speaking with surgical precision about my erratic leadership, my unilateral control tendencies, my refusal to implement oversight. Every sentence was built on a truth that had been twisted just enough to become something else. Something poisonous. They didn't need to invent a monster. They just needed to reframe the genius. And then came the line that told me exactly how deep this went. According to internal governance documents, Voss had already agreed to a structured redistribution of power prior to the board's decision. There it was. Consent. Again. Manufactured. Reinforced. Locked into public record before I had even spoken. I scrolled further. That's when I saw Owen's name. Quoted. On record. My chest tightened, not from shock. From confirmation. Elias has always been brilliant, he said. But brilliance without accountability can become dangerous. This wasn't personal. It was necessary. Necessary. I read that word 3 times. Because it didn't belong to him. Not the Owen I knew. Which meant one of two things. Either he had fully crossed over. Or someone had written that line for him. And he said it anyway. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling as the weight of it settled into something colder than anger. Clarity. Because betrayal stops hurting the moment it becomes predictable. At 7:30 a.m., the second wave hit. Regulatory inquiry confirmed. Not allegations. Not speculation. Inquiry. Which meant official. Which meant documented. Which meant someone had already submitted evidence. I didn't need to guess who. But I still didn't know what. And that was the real problem. Because you can't defend against a weapon you haven't seen. By 8:15, my lawyer stopped answering. By 9 o'clock, 2 of my early investors released a joint statement supporting the board's difficult but necessary decision. By 10:20, my largest personal account was frozen pending review. That one made me smile. Not because it was funny. Because it was fast. Too fast. Financial institutions don't move that quickly without pressure. External pressure. Structured pressure, which meant Celeste wasn't just playing inside the company. She was coordinating outside of it. Layered. Synchronized. Clean. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street 12 floors below. People moving normally. Cars passing. A man arguing into his phone like nothing had changed. That's the strange part about losing everything. The world doesn't pause to acknowledge it. It just keeps going. And expects you to disappear quietly. My phone buzzed again. This time, I recognized the name. Lena. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Hey, I said. Silence. Then, tell me it's not true. Her voice was steady. Too steady. Which meant she had already decided what she believed. I don't even know what it is yet, I replied. That's not an answer. No, I said. It's the only honest one. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear something in the background. News. My name again. They're saying you manipulated internal controls, she said. That you built systems no one else could access. I built systems no one else could break, I corrected. That's not what it looks like. There it was. Not what it looks like. Perception. Already winning. Lena, I said quietly, you know me. I thought I did. That one landed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to crack something that had been holding. I need space, she added quickly. Until this clears. Until this clears. As if truth worked on a timeline. As if damage waited for permission. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. And just like that. Home wasn't mine anymore either. By noon, they made their move. Press conference. Live. Of course it was live. Because humiliation works best in real time. Adrian stood at the podium with controlled gravity. Celeste to his right, composed and lethal. Owen slightly behind them, positioned perfectly, visible, but not central. The framing was intentional. Leadership. Control. Unity. I watched from my couch as the company I built spoke about me like I was a resolved problem. Voss, Vector remains strong, Adrian said. We have taken decisive action to ensure stability and continued growth. Decisive. Clean word. No blood in it. Celeste stepped forward next. We are cooperating fully with regulatory authorities. Transparency is our priority. Transparency. Another clean word. Used by people hiding everything. Then came the moment they had saved. Owen moved forward. My brother. My last variable. He looked directly into the camera. And for a split second, just one, I saw it. Hesitation. Gone as quickly as it appeared. But real. We're focused on moving forward, he said. The company is bigger than any one individual. There it was. The final cut. Not betrayal. Replacement. I wasn't being removed. I was being erased. Rewritten as an obstacle they had overcome. A liability they had outgrown. A past they had corrected. The stream ended. The room went silent. And for the first time since this began, I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was elegant. Everything aligned. Legal. Financial. Reputational. Personal. They hadn't just attacked me. They had closed every exit. Except one. I walked back to my laptop. Opened the hidden environment again. And this time, I didn't hesitate. Because now I understood something critical. They believed this was over. They believed I was contained. Neutralized. Finished. Which meant they had made the only mistake that matters in a war like this. They stopped looking for what they couldn't see. I entered the first key. Access granted. The system unfolded slowly. Quietly. Like it had been waiting. Layers of architecture I had built years ago began revealing themselves piece by piece, ownership shells, dormant contracts, conditional triggers, things I had designed back when control still meant something. Back when trust still existed. And buried deep inside it all, I found the first signal. Inactive. But not empty. Waiting. Tied to something very specific. Something dangerously precise. A governance condition. One they had just triggered this morning. My pulse steadied. Not faster. Sharper. Because now the question wasn't whether I could fight back. It was how far I was willing to let this play out. Before I ended it. And as I stared at the activation tree branching quietly across my screen, one realization settled in with absolute certainty. They hadn't just destroyed me publicly. They had just stepped directly into something I built. Without ever knowing it existed. And if I was right. This wasn't the beginning of my collapse, it was the beginning of theirs. The first rule of building something powerful is simple. Never make the core visible. Not to investors. Not to executives. Not even to allies. Because visibility invites control. And control invites theft. I learned that early, long before Adrian, before Celeste, before Owen ever stepped into my world. Back when Voss Vector was still fragile enough to be killed by a single bad decision, I built something no one asked for. Not a feature. Not a product. A contingency. I called it Layer 0. It didn't sit on top of the system. It didn't plug into it. It existed beneath everything, woven into the legal structure, the licensing chain, the deployment logic, and the governance permissions themselves. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And more importantly, impossible to remove without destroying the entire company. At the time, I told myself it was protection against acquisition abuse. Against hostile takeovers. Against external pressure. That was the lie. The truth was darker. I built it because I didn't trust what success would turn people into. And now, staring at the activation tree unfolding across my private terminal, I realized something that made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with something colder. They hadn't just triggered one mechanism. They had activated the first domino in a sequence I designed to escalate. Automatically. Irreversibly. I leaned closer to the screen. The interface hadn't changed in years. Minimal. Clean. Almost primitive by today's standards. No branding. No identifiers. Just a black field with branching logic structures pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. At the center, one line glowed brighter than the rest. Governance risk condition, confirmed. Below it. Phase I, initiated. I exhaled slowly. Phase I. That meant they had already crossed the first boundary. Without knowing it. Without seeing it. Without understanding what came next. I scrolled. The branches expanded. Legal pathways. Ownership contingencies. Escrow dependencies. Each one tied to real-world triggers, board votes, regulatory filings, executive authorizations. Every move they made inside the company. Echoed here. Tracked. Measured. Weaponized. And then I saw the clause. The one I had buried so deep it took me a full minute to recognize my own work. Adaptive Governance Override, 7.3c extension. My eyes narrowed. 7.3c. The same clause they used against me. Except this wasn't their version. This was mine. And theirs. Was just a fragment of it. A surface-level extraction. They thought they understood it. They thought they controlled it. But what they had implemented was only the visible half, the part that allowed authority redistribution. What they didn't know was that the full clause didn't just allow power to move. It determined where it ultimately returned. And under what conditions. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger. Not relief. Precision. Because now I could see the shape of the trap they had walked into. They believed they had centralized control. In reality, they had activated a system designed to detect centralized control as corruption. And respond. I clicked deeper. Phase I details expanded. Executive access reclassification, in progress. Internal permission drift, initiated. External compliance signal, queued. That last line caught my attention. Compliance signal. I froze for a moment. Because that shouldn't have triggered yet. Not unless. My mind replayed the phone call from earlier. Regulatory outreach. Documentation submitted. I felt it then. A slow, deliberate realization unfolding like a blade sliding into place. They thought they had reported me. But the system didn't interpret intent. It interpreted structure. Which meant the moment they filed those documents, they didn't expose me. They exposed themselves. I sat back, letting that settle. Because if I was right, and I was starting to become very certain I was, then phase I wasn't just internal. It was already moving outside the company. Into regulatory space. Into legal visibility. Into places they couldn't control with board votes and press conferences. I looked back at the screen. A countdown had appeared. Small. Unobtrusive. But very real. Phase 2 eligibility in 71 hours. 71 hours. That was the next threshold. Not activation. Eligibility. Meaning the system was waiting. Watching. Allowing them to continue. To escalate. To commit further. I almost laughed again. Because this wasn't just a trap. It was a funnel. Designed to let them believe they were winning. While guiding them exactly where I needed them to go. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. Then again. And again. Finally, I picked it up. Unknown number, different from before. I answered. Mr. Voss, a voice said. Female. Controlled. Government. Yes. This is a follow-up regarding the material submitted earlier today. We've encountered inconsistencies. I said nothing. Let her continue. The documentation suggests executive authority realignment under your approval, she said. However, certain structural dependencies indicate that authority may not have been legally transferable at the time of execution. There it was. The first crack. And it hadn't even been 24 hours. I see, I replied evenly. We'll need clarification, she added. From all parties involved. All parties. Not just me. Good. Because that meant the system had already done its job. It had forced them into visibility. And once you're visible to regulators, you don't control the narrative anymore. You survive it. I'm available, I said. I'm sure you are, she replied. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. Then looked back at the screen. The branches were still expanding. Quietly. Patiently. Like something alive. And for the first time since this began, I understood the full scope of what I had built. This wasn't a kill switch. It wasn't a single moment of destruction. It was a multi-phase collapse engine. One that required momentum. Participation. Escalation. Which meant the worst thing I could do now was stop them. They needed to keep going. Keep pushing. Keep tightening their own control. Because every step they took deeper into power was another step closer to losing it completely. I closed the terminal halfway. Not shutting it down. Just dimming it. Letting it run. Because now the timeline mattered more than anything. 71 hours until phase 2. But something else was forming beneath that. Another layer. Locked. Waiting. I hovered over it. Access restricted. Even to me. That made my pulse shift. Because I knew what that meant. I hadn't just built a system to respond to betrayal. I had built one that evolved beyond my control. One that would make decisions based on conditions. Not emotion. Not loyalty. Not mercy. I leaned back slowly. Eyes fixed on that locked layer. And one question surfaced, quiet, but heavy enough to change everything. When this reaches the final phase, will I still be the one in control? Arrogance doesn't arrive all at once. It builds. Quietly. Incrementally. Until the people standing at the top forget what it felt like to climb. 70 hours before phase 2 eligibility, Adrian Halbrecht walked onto a stage in Zurich to a standing ovation. I watched it live. Of course I did. Because nothing accelerates a collapse faster than success at the wrong moment. Voss, Vector is entering a new era, he said, hands relaxed, voice steady, the perfect image of controlled authority. We've eliminated internal inefficiencies and positioned ourselves for the most significant merger in modern logistics history. Eliminated. That was the word he chose. Not restructured. Not evolved. Eliminated. The audience didn't notice. But I did. Because language always tells the truth before people do. Celeste followed him, sharper, more precise. She outlined the merger, Halbrecht Global absorbing a European infrastructure giant, creating a predictive logistics monopoly across 3 continents. Billions in valuation. Regulatory fast-tracking. Institutional backing already secured. Too smooth. Too fast. Too perfect. And that was the problem. Because phase I was still running. Which meant everything they were building right now was sitting on unstable ground they didn't even know existed. I leaned back in my chair, watching as applause filled the hall. Then I checked the system. Phase I, progressing. Internal permission drift, 43%. External compliance signal, active. 43%. That was higher than it should have been. Which meant they weren't slowing down. They were accelerating. Good. Because acceleration under structural corruption doesn't create stability. It creates pressure. And pressure reveals fractures. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message. From a number I did recognize. Owen. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. We need to talk. Simple. Direct. Late. I didn't respond. Not yet. Because timing mattered now more than anything. Every interaction was a variable. Every variable could shift the sequence. And I wasn't about to disrupt something that was unfolding exactly as designed. By hour 62, the tone started to change. Not publicly. Publicly, they were untouchable. Stock climbing. Analysts praising. Media reframing the narrative completely. Strategic realignment drives record confidence. That was the new headline. I had gone from liability to footnote. Exactly where they wanted me. But internally, the cracks had begun. I saw it in the system first. Permission conflicts. Minor. Almost invisible. Access requests looping longer than they should. Authorization delays appearing in places that had always been instantaneous. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say something's wrong. But enough to create friction. And friction inside a company moving at this speed? That's dangerous. I traced one of the anomalies. Executive access override. Celeste. Denied. I paused. That shouldn't happen. Not under the structure they had just implemented. I ran the trace again. Same result. Denied. Not blocked. Not revoked. Reclassified. I felt a slow smile form. Because that meant phase I wasn't just observing anymore. It was adjusting. Subtly. Quietly. Rewriting the hierarchy from underneath them. And they had no idea. R56. Owen called. This time, I answered. You're not picking up messages, he said immediately. No, I replied. I'm not. A pause. Then, this is getting out of control. I almost laughed. Is it? Elias, he snapped, the first real crack in his voice I'd heard since this began. Regulators are asking questions we didn't anticipate. We? Interesting. What kind of questions? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Structural ones. There it was. The word he didn't want to say. Structure. Because structure is where truth lives. They're looking at governance dependencies, he continued. Authority chains. Ownership links that don't align. Don't align. I stood slowly, walking toward the window again. The city looked the same. But the game had changed completely. And what did you tell them? I asked. That it's a transitional artifact, he said quickly. That it'll resolve post-merger. I closed my eyes briefly. Because that answer was exactly what the system needed. Not resistance. Not correction. Continuation. You should have called me earlier, I said. I couldn't, he replied. Not with everything happening. No, I said quietly. You chose not to. Silence. Then, softer. We can fix this. I turned slightly, staring at my reflection in the glass. No, I said. You can't. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I cut in. You think this is a problem to manage. Another silence. He didn't argue. Because somewhere, deep down, he was starting to realize something was wrong in a way he couldn't control. Just stay quiet for now, he said finally. Let us handle it. Handle it. I almost admired the confidence. Of course, I said. Then I hung up. R48. Celeste made her first mistake. It didn't happen in public. It never does. It happened in a closed executive session with external counsel. But Layer 0 doesn't care about privacy. It cares about triggers. She attempted a full authority override. Not partial. Not conditional. Full. That was arrogance. And arrogance always escalates faster than intelligence. The system responded instantly. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But decisively. Permission drift, 67%. Executive authority confidence, degraded. Degraded. That word mattered. Because it meant the system had begun reclassifying them not as leaders, but as risks. I leaned forward, watching as new branches unlocked. Deeper ones. More aggressive ones. And then, the countdown shifted. Not just phase 2 anymore. A secondary timer appeared beneath it. Smaller. But far more dangerous. Regulatory synchronization, 36 hours. My pulse steadied again. Because now the layers were converging. Internal collapse. External exposure. And right in the middle of it. The merger. The stage they had built for their victory. The place where everything would peak. And break. That night, I received one final message. Not from Owen. Not from Adrian. From Celeste. No greeting. No pretense. Just a single line. If you're doing something, stop. I read it twice. Then once more. Because that message told me everything I needed to know. She didn't see the system. She didn't understand the mechanism. But she felt it. The drift. The instability. The loss of control. And for someone like Celeste, that was worse than failure. That was uncertainty. I typed a response. Simple. Precise. And sent it without hesitation. I already did. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. No reply. I set the phone down slowly. Then turned back to the screen. The system was quiet again. But not idle. Never idle, because now everything was aligned. The arrogance. The pressure. The timeline. And the stage. All that was left was to let them walk into the moment they believed would make them untouchable. And watch it become the exact moment that destroyed them. The timer ticked down. 35 hours. And for the first time since they tried to erase me, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was waiting. Because what they thought was their victory was already scheduled to become their collapse. 35 hours is a long time. If you're waiting to be saved, it's nothing. If you're watching someone walk toward a cliff they can't see. By the time the clock hit 32, Adrian was already celebrating. Private jet. Closed-door dinners. Pre-merger commitments being finalized like signatures were a formality instead of a risk. Every move he made now carried the quiet confidence of a man who believed the outcome was inevitable. That was the illusion Layer 0 was designed to create. Not fear. Certainty. Because certainty makes people move faster. And faster meant deeper. I watched the feeds carefully. Internal dashboards I still had indirect visibility into. External reporting cycles. Regulatory filings. Every signal was aligning exactly where I needed it. But something else caught my attention. Something subtle. The language. It had shifted again. Not in the media. In the contracts. I pulled one of the merger documents through a mirrored archive, a copy I shouldn't have had access to anymore, but Layer 0 had already begun rerouting fragments of data back to me. Clause headers. Appendices. Legal dependencies. And then I saw it. Buried inside a secondary compliance section. Conditional governance continuity, subject to existing control integrity. My pulse slowed. Because that wasn't their clause. That was mine. Or rather, a shadow of mine. They had integrated it into the merger framework without understanding what it actually referenced. Because to them, it was just legal reinforcement. To me, it was a trigger. I opened the deeper structure. And there it was. Connected. Quiet. Waiting. Countdown clause, armed. The words didn't blink. They didn't animate. They just existed. Like something that didn't need attention to be dangerous. This was the part I had almost forgotten. Not because it was small. Because it was patient. The countdown clause wasn't tied to a single action. It was tied to convergence. Multiple conditions aligning across legal, financial, and regulatory systems simultaneously. And once it began, it didn't stop. I leaned closer. The parameters unfolded. Executive authority instability above 60%. Regulatory inconsistency detection. Active merger liquidity event. Centralized control concentration. Every single one of them. Already satisfied. Except the last. Centralized control concentration. I checked the system. Executive authority confidence, 21%. Control distribution, collapsing. And then, a new line appeared. Centralization index, rising. I exhaled slowly. Because now I understood the final step. They needed to tighten control further. Not loosen it. Not stabilize it. Consolidate it, and Adrian would absolutely do that. Because when control starts slipping, men like him don't decentralize. They grip harder. Which meant phase 2 wasn't something I needed to trigger. It was something he would trigger himself. 28 hours. Owen called again. I didn't answer. Then again. Then a message. They're freezing internal transfers. This isn't normal. No. It wasn't. But it was necessary. Because liquidity restriction under unstable governance conditions? That fed directly into the clause. I opened the system again. Watched as financial pathways began constricting. Not blocked. Not yet. Just slowed. Like blood flow narrowing before a clot. 24 hours. Celeste moved. Aggressively. Emergency board session. Full authority consolidation proposal. Exactly as predicted. I accessed the meeting feed indirectly, audio fragments, transcript echoes, enough to reconstruct the moment. We are experiencing systemic permission inconsistencies, she said, voice sharper now, less controlled than before. This requires immediate central authority realignment. Translation. She wanted total control. Now. Not shared. Not distributed. Absolute. Adrian didn't hesitate. Do it. Of course he didn't. Because hesitation only exists when you understand risk. And he didn't. Not yet. Votes were cast. Fast. Unanimous. Even Owen. Again. That one lingered. Because this time, there was no hesitation. Just survival. The system responded instantly. Not with resistance. With acceptance. That was the beauty of it. It didn't fight control. It absorbed it. And the moment the resolution passed, the final condition flipped. Centralization index, confirmed. Everything went still. Not externally. Externally, nothing changed. But inside layer 0. The entire structure shifted. Like a lock turning. Slow. Deliberate. Final. Then the words appeared. Countdown clause, initiated. No alarm. No warning. Just inevitability. 20 hours. The first external signal hit. Regulatory escalation. Not inquiry. Escalation. Multiple agencies. Simultaneously. Requests upgraded to demands. Deadlines compressed, jurisdiction expanded. I watched as the system synchronized the pressure points perfectly. Legal. Financial. Operational. All tightening at once. 16 hours. Adrian stopped smiling. Not publicly. Publicly, he was still composed. Still controlled. But internally. His communication pattern shifted. Shorter messages. More directives. Less patience. The first stage. Annoyance. 12 hours. Celeste stopped pretending. Her tone changed completely. No more polished language. Now it was sharp. Direct. Urgent. Why are permissions still degrading? No one had an answer. Because there wasn't one they could understand. Confusion. 9 hours. Owen broke formation. He tried to reverse one of the authority structures. The system allowed the attempt. Then nullified it. Clean. Instant. I saw it in the logs. He tried again. Denied. Then again. Denied. That was when panic began. 6 hours. Liquidity restrictions tightened. Hard. Funds didn't just slow now. They stalled. Mid-transfer. Mid-execution. Millions suspended in motion. That's when the calls started overlapping. Executives talking over each other. Voices rising. Blame forming. 4 hours. The merger broadcast infrastructure went live. Cameras. Feeds. Global stream connections. Everything ready. Everything perfectly staged. A flawless moment. Waiting to happen. 3 hours. Celeste sent one final message. Not controlled. Not composed. Just raw. What did you build? I stared at it for a long time. Because that question. That was the first honest thing she had said since this began. I typed slowly. Deliberately. Something that finishes what you started. No reply. 2 hours. The system shifted again. Deeper layer. The one I couldn't access before. Unlocked. Not fully. Just enough. And what I saw there made my pulse change for the first time. Not faster. Not sharper. Heavier. Because this wasn't just collapse. This was exposure. Everything. Contracts. Off logs. Communications. Hidden dependencies. All queued. All ready. All waiting for a single moment. 1 hour. The countdown aligned with the broadcast. Of course it did. Because I had designed it that way. Not consciously. Not at the time. But layer 0 had evolved the logic. Optimized it. Chosen the point of maximum visibility. Maximum damage. Maximum truth. 30 minutes. I stood by the window again. Same view. Same city. Different world. Because now. There was no stopping it. Not for them. Not for me. 10 minutes. My phone buzzed. Owen. One last time. I answered. Elias, he said, voice breaking now, fully, what did you do? I closed my eyes briefly. Then answered honestly. I gave you exactly what you wanted. Silence. Then. You're going to destroy everything. I looked at the timer. Seconds ticking down. No, I said quietly. You did. I hung up. And as the final minute began, one last question surfaced. Not about them. Not about the company. About the system. Because as the final phase armed itself fully, one realization settled in with absolute clarity. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was something bigger. Something that didn't belong to me. And as the clock hit 0, I understood the real risk. Not whether they would survive what was coming. But whether I would still recognize what I had become. After it was over, the first failure didn't happen on camera. It never does. It happened 8 minutes before the broadcast. In a room no one outside the executive floor would ever see. Glass walls. Soundproofed. City stretched out behind it like a promise no one inside could keep. Adrian stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled once, jaw tight enough to fracture bone. Celeste was pacing now, no more stillness, no more control. Owen sat with both hands locked together, knuckles white, staring at a screen that wasn't responding the way it should. That was the moment the illusion broke. Not publicly. Internally. And once that happens, collapse is just a matter of time. Run it again, Celeste snapped. I did, the system's lead replied, voice thin. Authorization loops are cycling back. It's not accepting root commands. That's not possible. It's happening. Adrian stepped forward, slower than usual. Measured. Controlled. Then bypass it. We tried. Try again. They did. Same result. Denied. Not rejected. Reclassified. That word again. It echoed through the system like something alive. Celeste stopped pacing. What does that mean? She asked. No one answered. Because no one knew. And that was the first real crack. Confusion. 7 minutes to broadcast. External counsel joined the call. Faces on screens. Voices overlapping. Legal language colliding with technical failure. We're seeing regulatory escalation across multiple jurisdictions, one of them said. Requests are no longer informational, they're investigative. How? Adrian asked, calm but thinner now. That's what we're trying to determine. No. That's what they were trying to survive. Celeste turned sharply. Contain it. We can't contain multi-agency escalation without disclosure. Then control the disclosure. Silence. Because control was already gone. 6 minutes. Owen stood up suddenly. I can fix this. Every head turned. That was new. Because Owen didn't fix things. He managed them. Translated them. Smoothed them over. But now he sounded desperate. What are you going to do? Adrian asked. Owen hesitated. Then. I still have partial architecture mapping. There are layers. Elias built that. Celeste cut him off instantly. We don't need him. That landed harder than anything else in the room. Not because it was wrong. Because it was late. Too late. Owen didn't sit back down. That's the problem, he said quietly. We never did. Silence again. He had finally said it. Out loud. And the moment he did, everything shifted. Panic. 5 minutes, the screens changed. No one touched them. No command was given. But the system moved. Dashboards flickered. Interfaces reloaded. Access panels reorganized themselves like a structure correcting its own shape. And then, the message appeared. Across every internal screen. Clean. Simple. Unavoidable. Executive authority, revoked. No delay. No transition. No appeal. Just. Gone. Celeste stepped forward instantly. No, she said, sharp, controlled, refusing reality. She reached for the console. Override command. Entered manually. Executed. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Adrian moved next. Faster now. Less controlled. Give me direct access. You don't have it, someone said. I'm the CEO. The response came back instantly. Cold. Mechanical. Final. No longer recognized. That was the moment arrogance died. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a switch turning off. 4 minutes. Phone started ringing. Not internally. Externally. Investors. Partners. Banks. All at once. Because the system wasn't just collapsing internally anymore. It was broadcasting instability outward. Signals. Flags. Triggers. Every safeguard designed to protect capital. Now activating against them. Celeste grabbed her phone. This is Celeste Armand. I need to. She stopped mid-sentence. Looked at the screen. Then slowly lowered the phone. What? Adrian demanded. Her voice was different now. Not sharp. Not controlled. Flat. They've restricted executive communication channels. Owen let out a breath that sounded like something breaking. 3 minutes. The broadcast countdown appeared on the main screen. Global. Live in. 3 o'clock. Adrian turned toward it slowly. We proceed. Celeste looked at him. For the first time. Uncertain. We don't have control, she said. We have momentum, he replied. Wrong answer. Because momentum without control isn't power. It's collapse. 2 minutes. The legal team disconnected. Not by choice. Their feeds dropped. One by one. Gone. External counsel. Gone. Advisors. Gone. Isolation. Complete. Celeste looked around the room. For solutions. For leverage. For anything. There was nothing left. 90 seconds. Owen stepped back. Physically. Away from the table. Away from them. I didn't know it would do this, he said. No one responded. Because intent didn't matter anymore. Only consequence. 60 seconds. The screen shifted again. Not error. Not failure. Alignment. Everything simplifying. Stripping down. Preparing. 30 seconds. Adrian straightened his jacket. Forced composure back into place. Because men like him don't break before the audience arrives. They perform. Even at the edge. 15 seconds. Celeste stopped moving. Completely. Still. Watching. Calculating. And for the first time since this began. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to understand. 10 seconds. Owen closed his eyes. Just briefly. Like he already knew. 5 seconds. Every screen in the room went black. 3. A single line appeared. Property of Elias Voss. 2. The broadcast feed connected. 1. And as the world tuned in. As the cameras went live. As the illusion of control was projected across millions of screens. Only one question remained. Not whether they were about to fall, but how much of the truth was about to fall with them. The world saw confidence. That's how it began. Adrian Halbrecht stepped onto the stage with the same controlled authority that had built his empire. The lights were perfect. The framing was flawless. The audience, global, institutional, watching from boardrooms and trading floors, leaned in exactly as expected. Because nothing looked wrong. Not yet. Today marks a defining moment, Adrian began, voice steady, measured, absolute. A convergence of innovation, infrastructure, and vision. The first glitch hit behind him. Small. Almost nothing. A flicker across the presentation screen. Most people wouldn't notice. But Celeste did. I saw it in the way her posture shifted half an inch. Tension. Recognition. Too late. Adrian continued. Creating a unified platform that will redefine global logistics. The screen stabilized. For exactly 2 seconds. Then changed. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just. Replaced. The merger logo vanished. In its place. A document header appeared. Black text. White background. Legal formatting. Cold. Precise. Governance override record, internal. Adrian stopped speaking. Just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Because hesitation, on a stage like that, is blood in the water. Apologies, he said smoothly, recovering. We're experiencing a minor technical. The document scrolled. On its own. Names. Dates. Authorizations. And then. His signature. Digitally verified. Timestamped. Attached to the exact clause they used to remove me. Except now. The full version was visible. Unedited. Uncontrolled. And beneath it. A second section expanded. Dependent structural conditions, active. Celeste stepped forward instantly. Cut the feed, she said under her breath. No response. Because there was no one left to cut it. The system wasn't glitching. It was executing. Across the world, analysts leaned closer. Lawyers froze mid-note. Investors stopped speaking. Because what they were seeing wasn't a presentation. It was evidence. Adrian tried to regain control. This is clearly an internal. The screen shifted again. Faster now. Less subtle. Logs. Raw. Unfiltered. Authorization chains. Permission changes. Timestamped actions. Every move they made over the last 72 hours. Displayed. Connected. Irrefutable. And then. The first external overlay appeared. Regulatory flag, structural misrepresentation. That was the moment the room changed. Not physically. Psychologically. Because that label. That single phrase. Turned a corporate event into a legal crisis. Live. Global. Unstoppable. Celeste grabbed a microphone. Please remain calm, she said, voice sharp, cutting through the noise. We are addressing. The system cut her audio. Mid-sentence. Not muted. Revoked. Her mic went dead in her hand. She stared at it for half a second. Then looked up. And for the first time since I met her. She didn't have control of the room. Owen stepped back. Further. Almost off stage now. His eyes weren't on the audience. They were on the screens. Because he understood something the others didn't. This wasn't random. This was structured. Designed. And there was only one person who could have built something like this. Me. The next phase began. Not visually. Systemically. Across global financial networks, alerts triggered simultaneously. Liquidity freezes. Escrow suspensions. Transaction holds. The merger. Paused. Not by choice. By force. I watched it cascade in real time. Because Layer 0 wasn't just exposing them. It was locking the environment around them. No exits. No reversals. No control. Back on stage, Adrian's composure cracked. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Shut it down, he said, no longer performing. IT can't be shut down, someone shouted from offstage. That echoed. Loud enough for microphones to catch. Loud enough for the world to hear. And just like that, confidence became doubt. The screen changed again. Final layer. The one I hadn't fully seen before. The one Layer 0 had evolved into on its own. Full disclosure protocol, initiated. This wasn't just internal anymore. This was everything. Private communications. Boardroom recordings. Side agreements. Hidden clauses. All queued. All releasing. Sequentially. The first clip played. Celeste. Weeks earlier. Private meeting. Clear audio. Elias is the asset, she said. Which is why Elias is the problem. The room, global now, reacted. Audibly. A ripple. Shock. Recognition. Because context had just been added. Intent. Second clip. Adrian. Then we solve the problem before the merger cycle begins. Silence followed. Not confusion. Understanding. Third. Owen. The hardest one. I'll handle him. No hesitation. No pressure. Just. Decision. Back on stage, Owen didn't move. Didn't speak. Because there was nothing left to defend. Only truth. The system paused. Just for a moment. Letting it settle. Letting the weight of it land. Then. The final trigger executed. Controlling interest reassigned. The same message from the beginning. Now global. Now undeniable. Now irreversible. And beneath it. Ownership structures unfolded. Shell entities. Licensing chains. Buried contracts. All leading back to one endpoint. One name. Mine. Adrian staggered half a step. Just one. But enough. Because men like him don't lose balance. Ever. Impossible, he said. But it wasn't a statement. It was a realization. Celeste didn't speak. Didn't move. Didn't fight. Because she understood faster than anyone else. This wasn't a system failure. This was a system working exactly as designed. Just not by her. Owen finally looked up. Not at the screens. At the camera. And for a brief second. Our eyes met. Across distance. Across everything. And he knew. He knew this had been in motion long before he made his choice. Then came the final line. Simple. Unavoidable. Burned into every screen. Property of Elias Voss. No applause. No music. No transition. Just silence. Global. Heavy. Permanent. And standing alone in my apartment, watching the empire that erased me collapse in real time. One final thought settled in. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Something colder. Cleaner. Final. Because this wasn't the end. Not yet. Collapse is only half of revenge. The other half is what comes after. And as the feeds cut, the markets halted, and the first legal actions began flooding in. Only one question remained. Not whether they had fallen, but how far they were about to be dragged. Before they hit the bottom, silence doesn't last long in markets. It fractures. Then it screams. 9 minutes after the broadcast cut, trading resumed under restriction. Not full suspension, worse. Controlled exposure. Enough movement to let the world react, not enough to let anyone escape. I watched the ticker reopen like a vein. Halbrecht Global dropped 12% in the first 30 seconds. 23 by the first minute. Then the halt hit. Temporary. Mandatory. Meaning regulators were already inside. Not circling. Inside. My phone didn't vibrate anymore. It detonated. Calls. Messages. Unknown numbers. No numbers. People who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly remembering I existed. I ignored all of them. Except one. Adrian. Of course. I let it ring twice. Then answered. You did this, he said. Not a question. A realization still trying to reshape itself into denial. Yes. Silence. Not shock. Calculation. How do we reverse it? There it was. Not apology. Not anger. Bargaining. You don't, I said. A pause. Longer this time. You're destroying shareholder value. I almost smiled. No, I said calmly. You misrepresented governance structure during a live merger event while under regulatory review. Another pause. Because language. Precise language. Is where power lives. We can fix this, he said. You can step back in. Publicly. Stabilize it. There it was. The offer. The illusion of control being handed back like nothing had happened. I leaned back in my chair. Say it, I said. Silence. Then. What? Say what you did. A breath. Measured. Controlled. Even now. We acted in the company's best interest. I closed my eyes briefly. Wrong answer. Then deal with the consequences, I said. And I hung up. 5 minutes later. Celeste called. I let it ring longer. Because she wasn't calling to negotiate. She was calling to understand. That made her more dangerous. I answered. What is layer 0? She asked immediately. No pretense. No delay. Straight to it. I respected that. It's the part of the system you never saw, I said. I saw everything. No, I replied quietly. You saw what I wanted visible. Silence. Then. You embedded legal dependencies into operational architecture. Not a question. Recognition. Yes. That's not enforceable. It already enforced. Another pause. Sharper. Because she was recalculating in real time. If this continues, she said, voice tightening slightly, you don't just destroy us. You destroy the company. No, I said. I remove what shouldn't be controlling it, and replace it with what? I looked at the screen. My name's still there. Unavoidable. Something that doesn't betray itself. That was when her tone changed. Not calculation. Not control. Threat. You think regulators won't come after you too? They already did, I said. That's why this works. Silence again. But this one. Heavier. Because now she understood the full shape. Not just the system. The timing. The alignment. Everything. You planned this, she said. No, I replied. A beat. Then. I prepared for you. And for the first time. She didn't respond. I ended the call. Owen didn't call immediately. He waited. 43 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Because with him, timing mattered more than words. When it finally came, I answered on the first ring. He didn't speak right away. Just breathing. Unsteady. You could have told me, he said. There it was. Not denial. Not defense. Desperation. I did, I replied. No, you didn't. I warned you, I said. You just didn't listen. Silence. Then. I didn't think. I know. That cut him. I heard it. You think I wanted this? He asked. I stood slowly, walking back to the window. I think you chose it, I said. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed. It's worse. Another silence. Longer. Because now. There was nothing left to hide behind. They're going to charge us, he said finally. Not me. Us. Interesting. They're going to charge you, I corrected. And you? I looked down at the street again. Same movement. Same city. Different gravity. I built the system that exposed it, I said. Not the actions it revealed. That won't matter. It will, I replied. Because I didn't lie. That one landed. Hard. Elias, he said, voice breaking now, fully. This was the moment. The lowest point. The place where people reach for anything. I can testify, he said quickly. I can explain what happened. Shift responsibility. There it was. The final stage. Bargaining turning into sacrifice. Whose responsibility? I asked. Silence. Because he understood the question. And what answering it meant. You want me to say it was them, he said. I want you to tell the truth. That destroys me. I didn't answer immediately. Because this mattered. Not for the system. For him. It already did, I said quietly. Nothing came back. Just breathing. Then. A whisper. I'm sorry. I closed my eyes. Not because it fixed anything. Because it didn't. Because some things, once done, don't reverse. I know, I said. And that was the end of it. No shouting. No forgiveness. Just truth. And consequence. By the time the second trading halt lifted, the collapse wasn't a question anymore. It was a cascade. Board members resigning. Legal teams distancing. Partners withdrawing. Every layer of protection they built turning into distance. Because no one stands close to something collapsing that publicly. That night, they held a press conference. Not planned. Not polished. Forced. Adrian stood there again. Same man. Different reality. We are cooperating fully with authorities, he said. But this time, no one believed him. Celeste didn't speak. She stood beside him. Silent. Watching. Already calculating survival. And Owen. Owen wasn't there. Because some collapses. You don't face publicly. You survive privately. If you can. I turned the screen off. Room quiet again. System still running in the background. Final phase complete. Nothing left to trigger. Nothing left to escalate. Only aftermath. And as I stood there, one final realization settled in. Revenge isn't the moment they fall. It's the moment they understand. They built the fall themselves. And now, there was only one thing left. Not destruction. Not exposure. Something harder. Something final. What I would become. After all of this was over, collapse is loud. Aftermath is silent. 3 weeks later, no one was talking about the merger anymore. Because there was no merger. There was only litigation. Investigations. Asset seizures. And a corporate structure so thoroughly dissected that entire sections of it no longer legally existed. Halbrecht Global didn't fall in a single moment. It dissolved. Piece by piece. Adrian was the first to go. Not publicly at first. That came later. It started with resignation. Then indictment. Then the footage. Him walking into federal court without the composure he once wore like armor. No cameras inside. But enough outside. Enough to capture the shift. From power. To process. Celeste lasted longer. Of course she did. She adapted. Pivoted. Tried to isolate liability. Distance herself from decisions she had architected. But Layer Zero didn't forget. Because it wasn't built to. The records didn't just show what happened. They showed who designed it. Precision cuts deeper than volume. Her downfall wasn't loud. It was surgical. Disbarment proceedings. Frozen accounts. Quiet removals from boards that once competed to have her. She didn't collapse. She was removed. Systematically. Exactly the way she removed me. And Owen. Owen didn't fight. That was the difference. He cooperated early. Full disclosure. Every internal conversation. Every meeting. Every decision. Not out of strategy. Out of exhaustion. He didn't try to survive the system. He stepped out of it. His name didn't disappear. But it changed. From architect. To witness. And somehow. That was worse. Voss, Vector still existed. That surprised a lot of people. They expected ashes. Instead. They got restructuring. Because the system hadn't destroyed the company. It had purified control. Stripped away everything that didn't belong. Left the core intact. And now, that core was mine again. Legally. Irrefutably. I didn't step back in immediately. That would have been a mistake. Because power reclaimed too quickly looks like desperation. And I wasn't desperate anymore. I waited. Let the dust settle. Let the narrative stabilize. Let the world decide what this had been. Scandal. Correction. Reckoning. It didn't matter. Because beneath all of it, the structure was clean. For the first time in years. The board meeting was smaller now. Different faces. No legacy power. No hidden alliances. Just people who understood exactly what had happened. And what it meant. I walked in without announcement. No resistance. No hesitation. Because this time, there was no question of authority. I didn't sit at the head of the table immediately. I stood. Looked at each of them, measured. Present. Real. Before we begin, I said, there's something you need to understand. No one spoke. Good. This company doesn't belong to the board, I continued. It doesn't belong to investors. And it doesn't belong to me. A slight shift in the room. Confusion. Curiosity. It belongs to the system that keeps it honest, I said. Silence. Because they didn't fully understand. Not yet. And that was intentional. Because layer 0 didn't go away. It didn't deactivate. It didn't disappear once it worked. It remained. Quiet. Watching. Ensuring. I had learned something through all of this. Not about revenge. Not about power. About structure. Because people fail. Always. Eventually. But systems. Systems endure. If they're built correctly. After the meeting, I went back to the tower. Same building. Different gravity. The lobby was quieter now. Less movement. More awareness. People looked at me differently. Not with admiration. Not with fear. Something else. Recognition. Truth has weight. And once people see it, they don't forget. I stepped into the elevator. Alone. Top floor. The doors opened slowly. And there it was. The office. Glass walls. City stretching endlessly beyond it. The same view Adrian once stood in front of. The same place he believed made him untouchable. I walked inside. No hesitation. No ceremony. Just movement. Because this wasn't about reclaiming space. It was about redefining it. I reached the desk. Paused, then looked up. At the building across the street. Because that's where it had always been. The reflection. Clear. Unavoidable. And for the first time since this began. I saw it. Not the collapse. Not the revenge. The result. A structure that couldn't be taken the same way again. A system that didn't rely on trust to function. A name. Reclaimed. But not in the way it was before. Stronger. Colder. Untouchable. Later that week. They changed the signage. No announcement. No press release. Just. Replacement. The old name removed. The new one installed. Simple. Clean. Final. Voss Vector. Not as a memory. Not as a legacy. As control. That night, I stood alone in the office again. City alive below. System running quietly behind everything. No alerts. No triggers. No collapse. Just stability. Earned. Engineered. Permanent. And as I looked out across the skyline, one final thought settled in. Not a question. Not a doubt. A certainty. They tried to erase me. Instead, they activated something they couldn't understand. Something they couldn't stop. Something that didn't just survive betrayal. It required it. Because the truth is, I didn't win when they fell. I won the moment I made it impossible for anyone to ever do it again.